Good morning. We continue with block 5th of paper 5 and this is the session 2. In this particular session, we would be looking at Gugiwa Thiong's work, Chinua Achebe's work and Namwar Singh's Decolonizing the Indian Mind. We start with the Kenyan-born Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Decolonization of the Mind. He was born in he wrote this book in 1986, Decolonizing the Mind, the Politics of Language in African Literature, and can be thought of in part of a continuation of Martinique-born Frantz Fanon's earlier anti-colonial book, Black Skin, White Mask, which was written in 1952. Each of these books can be considered both colonial and post-colonial. The reason, colonial because they examine the effects of teaching colonial children foreign or European languages or culture at the expense of native languages or culture. And post-colonial because they both argue that these effects are detrimental to the colonized regions. Now his general argument in this selection is that a national culture must include that nation's literature expressed in that nation's native language. In other words, he argues that the English, in that he includes the Spanish and French and Portuguese, all these languages ought not to be the language of education and culture in areas where it was used as an implement of colonial domination. He opens this selection by arguing, I quote, "The language of African literature cannot be discussed meaningfully outside the context of those social forces which have made it both an issue demanding our attention and a problem calling for a resolution." Unquote. Now those social forces, like he says, social forces, now they can be understood as a colonialism and the desires and struggles of African people to reclaim their economies, politics, and cultures from the colonial chokehold. He traces his interest in the discussion of the language of African literature through his childhood education in Kenya and his participation in a number of conferences on the subject, including his participation at the 1962 conference, a conference of African writers of English expression. He explains that only the African writers who had published in English were eligible to participate in the conference, which had as its initial point of inquiry the question, what is African literature? Considering the question in the light of his English education and with the benefit of 26 years, he explains why African literature must not be conceived of in European or, in a matter of fact, other non native languages. He argues language was the means of spiritual subjugation of the colonized by the colonizer and therefore cannot express the inherent Africanness that an African literature must express. In explaining how language was used for spiritual subjugation, he looks to his own education. He described Giku as the language of his peasant families' communication with each other, with the community at large, and as their means to share culture, namely through orature. As a child growing up in this community, his language remained unified until he went to school and was taught to elevate English language and to devalue his language, the Giku language. He argues that language, I quote from the text, is both a means of communication and a carrier of culture. Now, these have three aspects. Now, this characteristic has three separate aspects. First, language as communication. Communication could be expressing your ideas, your views, or seeking somebody else's opinion about something in a particular matter. Now, language as communication is the language of real life. It is the speech which meditates human relations, and written language which imitates the speech itself. Now, language as a carrier of culture is, he says, a product of reflection of human beings communicating with one another in the very struggle to create wealth and control it. Next, he says, it is an image forming agent in the mind of a child. And he says it is the transmitter of those images of the world and reality through a specific language. Now, until his English education, he claims these 6 aspects were harmonious in his native Giku. He argues that colonialism's real goal, the motto or the motive was to control. To control the entire realm of the language of real life. As it's said, language is the key to every culture. So, to do so, the colonial powers consciously elevated English and consciously devalued the native language. So, in school, the children were taught to use English exclusively. But this language could never adequately express the experience of a Kenyan child since it developed to express the experience of the English. Now, English as language of communication for the Kenyans thus failed to allow full communication. English as a language of culture also failed Kenyans because the colonial child was made to see the world and where he stands in it as seen and defined or reflected in the culture of imposition. English literature, even at its most innocuous, taught as reflecting universal humanism, reflected that universal humanism from a specifically English position. Now, even when texts were translated into English, the literature was ecocentric and the resulting education was alienating. The reason behind it was now because English literature, even when it was written by Africans, the native people there, it could not express the African culture. Reason? Well, because culture is inextricably tied to its native language. And African literature must be written in African languages. He states that English literature syllabi at African universities, they were almost identical or almost the same in their coverage of the English canon and inclusive of ancient and modern European drama. Although he writes specifically about African colonies, but given the scope of European colonialism and the formalic language subjugation, I believe his argument is applicable to the other areas of colonialism, including the Caribbean. Now, St. Lucian born Derek Walcott's Omeros comes to mind as an illustration for Thiongo's argument. It is written almost completely in English. Homeros is loosely based on Homer's Iliad and Odyssey and is set on St. Lucia, an island with a long history of colonial rule, vacillating between French and British rule. In 1899, Joseph Conrad published a short work of fiction called Heart of Darkness. This novella is often read, discussed, criticized in literature programs throughout the world. It is a work that allows us to tackle a variety of topics and is therefore responded to in a variety of ways. The work itself, as one critic puts it, I quote, might most usefully be considered hyper canonized, unquote. Now, the work is taught beyond the realm of a normal work in literature program. Many forms of criticism have taken on the subject matter within the book. Feminism, psychoanalytic, Marxism have all had things to say about novella. They have discussed things such as imperialism, the psychology of Marlowe and Kurtz, the role of women in the novella, well, both literally and symbolically. All these issues are important topics in a novella. For a long time, however, one crucial issue in the work was not addressed. That was of race. Now, moving on to the next we'd be doing is Chinua Achebe. Now, Achebe's criticism of Conrad is not limited to this essay. He is, in fact, a well read novelist. He has won several awards for his numerous books, including an award for a book of children's poetry. He has published 5 novels like Anthills of Savannah, Arrow of God, Girls at War and Other Stories, A Man of People, No Longer at Ease, and his famous Things Fall Apart. It is within the context of the last 2 works, No Longer at Ease and Things Fall Apart, that we can see Achebe's challenging some of the ideas in Conrad's work. Now, if we look at Things Fall Apart, it is the story of a classic tragic hero whose great strengths are inevitably his great flaws. The setting is a rural village in Nigeria. The people of the village belong to the tribe of Igbo. The main character, Okunwo, ruled his household with a heavy hand, and his family lived in perpetual fear of his fiery temper. He was also a great warrior, wrestler, and farmer. Now, all these things culminate in the end when he is confronted with the encroaching colonialism. And he simply reacts by killing one of the magistrates. In the end, what we see is he also makes a bold statement, defiling himself by hanging himself on a tree. No longer at ease. Now, this is set in the same area and is concerned with the same tribe and family a generation later. Now, colonialism has taken strong hold of Africa, and the main character, Obi, has just returned from his studies in England. He is the first of the tribe and family to study abroad. He has returned with the hopes of changing the corruption within his city and country. Achebe sets the tone of this piece with a speech given by one of the elders of the tribe. I quote, "Today greatness has changed its tune. Titles are no longer great, neither are barns or large number of wives and children. Greatness is now in the things of the white man, and so we too have changed our tune." Unquote. What we have in this novel is the way Nigerian culture is changing to fit Western ideals. If we look at detail in both the novels, we can say that these two were written in response to Heart of Darkness because they are giving us the other side of the story. There are always two sides to a coin. We see the other side in these two stories. Now are seeing colonialism from the perspective of Africans who are being colonized. Achebe does a great job in writing clearly but not giving us a clear black and white picture. There is never a clear statement of these people are right and those people are wrong. There is nowhere in the text that we see that the blame game is played, that we are right and we are wrong or something of that sort, or like we are right and they are wrong. We never see that instance in the entire thing. Now, many critics have responded to the challenges that Achebe has brought, both in his literature and his essay. There are some who have defended Conrad on the grounds that, with stating that the work was ahead of its time. There are some who believe that Achebe's argument is it's oversimplified. It's an attack on race. They also believe that it would be easier for Achebe to just write Conrad off. But these things may not be as simple or easy as the people think of it. It's not easy. We must realize that there are no simple answers to Achebe's charges. That is, what makes them stand out and cause such a turmoil over whether Heart of Darkness can it be seen as a work that is racist in orientation, and it would be impossible and a waste of time and effort to try to go into the psychology of Conrad. It would be hard for us to say that he was out and out racist as Achebe claims it. Along with that, the very structure of Heart of Darkness does not make it easy for us to tell whether or not Marlowe is really a reliable narrator. And how could we ever assume what Conrad would say or do if he were alive today? He's not, we are. We do have a moral obligation here as readers need to be thinking as critically as possible. We must recognize the flaws of any work of literature and the flaws that may be contained within any historical context. Now, of course, that does not mean that we can excuse something immoral just because of the time period it was written in. To do so, it would be to walk on treacherous ground, to wade into dangerous waters. It would open up excuses for immoral behavior now and in the future. To overlook racist or sexist context just because something was written a long time ago would be to go against the evolution of the human spirit. Now, moving from one continent to other, we come to India. Now, let's talk about an Indian critic, Namvar Singh. Now, according to the great Hindi critic Namvar Singh, the decolonization is the greatest event of the 20th century. He writes in his Decolonizing the Indian Mind. In that essay, he writes this out. And he points out that the emergence of new literature from countries like Latin America, Africa, and Asia. He believes that the emergence of these literature led to the early emergence of decolonization. He defines these as third world literature. And this, according to him, is a form of new Orientalism of the post colonial age. He is of a firm belief, he holds to his ground that we cannot reach a firm decision for the topics like tradition, modernity, regional, and national identity with decolonization. He is of an opinion that the awareness of Indian authors of the issues which have emerged from the decolonization is connected directly or to the release of their productive energies. Keeping the fact in mind that our land has not produced greats like Marcus or Achebe. He debated that to fight against imperialism and nationalism, he debated that to fight against imperialism, nationalism is required, which weakens with time. As time progresses, it kind of slows down and weakens down. But without it, imperialism cannot be fought and defeated. You need to have that nationalist feeling, which is still relevant as and has its position in the post-colonial world. One of the reasons he pleads for compromise is the fact that India was granted independence and we never gained it. It was because we accepted partition, our identity broke down. In his essay, he concludes by saying that although we have come out of the colonial rule, we won't come out from its new form. He says a new form has emerged. The essay loosely discussed as it was a speech which was later translated and transcribed. His methodology is unavailable to find out the level of his intention. But we sense the urgent need to fight neo-colonialism, not just in India, but also in Indian literature. especially in the case of Indian writings in English. Now, coming to the last part of it, in the present scenario, where worldwide print capitalism and big global market for books, big industries of translations have helped writers to earn a hefty amount of money and an identity and recognition. The uneven distribution of money as well as power among Indian English writers and Indian writers of regional languages have drawn the attention of Indian writers to English writing. The Namvar Singh is very much aware of these problems and he warns us against these things. We end the fifth unit with this. We have discussed in this unit, in this presentation, we have discussed Thiongo's work, Achebey's criticism, Namvar Singh's decolonizing the Indian mind. Thank you.